To discuss the problems connected with the stages of human development is an exacting task, for it means nothing less than unfolding a picture of psychic life in its entirety from the cradle to the grave. Within the framework of a lecture, such a task can be carried out only on the broadest lines, and it must be well understood that no attempt will be made to describe the normal psychic occurrences within the various stages. We shall restrict ourselves rather to certain problems, that is, to things that are difficult, questionable, or ambiguous. In a word, to questions which allow of more than one answer, and moreover, answers that are always open to doubt. For this reason, there will be much to which we must add a question mark in our thought. Worse still, there will be some things we must accept on faith, while now and then we must even indulge in speculations. If psychic life consisted only of self-evident matters of fact, which on a primitive level is still the case, we could content ourselves with the sturdy empiricism. The psychic life of civilized man, however, is full of problems. We cannot even think of it except in terms of problems. Our psychic processes are made up of, to a large extent, of reflections, doubts, experiments, all of which are almost completely foreign to the unconscious, instinctive mind of primitive man. It is the growth of consciousness which we must thank for the existence of problems. They are Dan's gift of civilization. It is just man's turning away from instinct, his opposing himself to instinct, that creates consciousness. Instinct is nature and seeks to perpetuate nature, whereas consciousness can only seek culture or its denial. Even when we turn back to nature, inspired by the Rousseau-esque longing, we cultivate nature. As long as we are still submerged in nature, we are unconscious, and we live in the security of instinct which knows no problems. Everything in us that still belongs to nature shrinks away from a problem, for its name is doubt. And wherever doubt holds a sway, there is certainly and the possibility of divergent ways. And where several ways seem possible, there we have turned away from the certain guidance of instinct and are handed over to fear. For consciousness is now called upon to do that which nature has always done for her children, namely, to give a certain, unquestionable, unequivocal decision, and here we are beset by an all too human fear that consciousness, our Promethean conquest, may in the end not be able to serve us as well as nature. Problems thus draw us into an orphaned and isolated state where we are abandoned by nature and we are driven to consciousness. There is no other way to open to us. We are forced to resort to conscious decisions and solutions where formerly we trusted ourselves to natural happenings. Every problem, therefore, brings the possibility of a widening of consciousness, but also the necessity of saying goodbye to childlike unconsciousness and trust in nature. This necessity is a psychic fact of such importance that it constitutes one of the most essential symbolic teachings of the Christian religion. It is the sacrifice of the merely natural man, of the unconscious, ingenuous being whose tragic career began with the eating of the apple in paradise. The biblical fall of man presents the dawn of consciousness as a curse, and as a matter of fact, it is in this light that we first look upon every problem that forces us to greater consciousness and separates us even further from the paradise of unconscious childhood. Every one of us gladly turns away from his problems. If possible, they must not be mentioned, or better still, their existence is denied. We wish to make our lives simple, certain, and smooth, and for that reason, problems are taboo. We want to have certainties and no doubts, results, and no experiments, without even seeing that certainties can arise only through doubt and results only through experiment. The artful denial of a problem will not produce conviction. On the contrary, a wider and higher consciousness is required to give us the certainty and clarity we need. This introduction, long as it is, seemed to me necessary in order to make clear the nature of our subject. When we must deal with problems, we instinctively resist trying the way that leads to obscurity and darkness. We wish to only hear of inquotable results and completely forget that these results can only be brought about when we have ventured into and emerged from the darkness. But to penetrate the darkness, we must summon all the powers of enlightenment that consciousness can offer. As I have already said, we must even indulge in speculations. For in treating the problems of psychic life, we perpetually stumble upon questions of principle belonging to the private domains of the most heterogeneous branches of knowledge. We disturb and anger the theologian no less than the philosopher, the physician no less than the educator. We even grope about in the field of biologists. End of the historian. This extravagant behavior is due not to the arrogance, but to the circumstance that man's psyche is a unique combination of factors which are at the same time the special subjects of far-reaching lines of research. For it is out of himself and out of his peculiar constitution that man has produced his sciences. They are symptoms of his psyche. If therefore we must ask ourselves of the unavoidable question, why does man, in obvious contrast to the animal world, have problems at all? We run into that indestructible tangent of thoughts which many thousands of incisive minds have woven in the course of the centuries. I shall not perform the labors of a Sisyphus upon this masterpiece of confusion, but will try to present quite simply my contribution toward man's attempt to answer this basic question. There are no problems without consciousness. We must therefore put the question in another way and ask, how does consciousness arise in the first place? Nobody can say with certainty, but we can observe small children in the process of becoming conscious. Every parent can see it if he pays attention. And what we see is this: when the child recognizes someone or something, when he knows a person or a thing, then we feel the child has consciousness. That, no doubt, is also why in paradise it was the tree of knowledge which bore such fateful fruit. But what is recognition of knowledge in this sense? We speak of knowing something when we succeed in the linking of a new perception to an already existing context, in such a way that we hold in consciousness not only the perception, but parts of this context as well. Knowing is based, therefore, upon the perceived connection between psychic contents. We can have no knowledge of a content that is not connected with anything, and we cannot even be conscious of it should our consciousness be still on this low initial level. Accordingly, the first stage of consciousness, which we can observe, consists in the mere connection between two or more psychic contents. At this level, consciousness is merely sporadic, being limited to the perception of a few connections, and the content is not remembered later on. It is a fact that in the early years of life, there is no continuous memory. At most, there are islands of consciousness which are like single lamps or lighted objects in the far-flung darkness. But these islands of memory are not the same as those earliest connections which are merely perceived. They contain a new, very important self, the so-called ego. This series, like the initial series of contents, is at first merely perceived, and for this reason, the child logically begins by speaking of itself objectively in the third person. Only later, when the ego contents, the so-called ego complex, have acquired an energy of their own, very likely as a result of training and practice, does the feeling of subjectivity or I-ness arise. This may well be the moment when the child begins to speak of itself in the first person. The continuity of memory probably begins at this stage. Therefore, it will be a continuity of ego memories. In the childish stage of consciousness, there are as yet no problems. Nothing depends on the subject, for the child itself is wholly dependent on its parents. It is as though it was not completely born, but were still enclosed in the psychic atmosphere of his parents. Psychic birth, and with it, the conscious differentiation from the parents, normally takes place at puberty, with the eruption of sexuality. The psychological change is attended by a psychic revolution, for the various bodily manifestations give such an emphasis to the ego, but it often asserts itself without stint or moderation. This is sometimes called the unbearable age. Until this period is reached by the psychic life of the individual is largely governed by instinct. A few or no problems arise, even when external limitations oppose the subjective impulses. These restraints do not put the individual at variance with himself. He submits to them or circumvents them, remaining quite at one with himself. He does not yet know the state of inner tension induced by a problem. This state only arises when what was once an external limitation becomes an inner one. When one impulse is opposed by another, in psychological language we would say the problematical state. The inner division with oneself arises when side by side with the series of ego contents, a second series of equal intensity comes into being. This second series, because of its energy value, has a functional significance equal to that of the ego complex. We might call it another, second ego, which can on occasion even wrest the leadership from the first. This produces the division with oneself, the state that betokens a problem. To recapitulate what we have said, the first stage of consciousness, consisting in merely recognizing or knowing, is an anarchic or chaotic state. The second, that of the developed ego complex, is monarchic or monistic. The third brings another step forward in consciousness and consists in an awareness of the divided or dualistic state. And here we come to our real theme, the problem of the stages of life. First of all, we must deal with the period of youth. It extends roughly from the years just after puberty to middle life, which itself begins between 35th and 40th year. I might well be asked why I began with the second stage, as though there are no problems connected with childhood. The complex psychic life of the child is, of course, a problem of the first magnitude to parents, educators, and doctors. But when the normal child has no real problems of its own, it is only the adult human being who can have doubts about himself and be at variance with himself. We are all familiar with the sources of the problems that arise in the period of youth. For most people, it is the demands of life which harshly put an end to the dream of childhood. If the individual is sufficiently well prepared, the transition to a profession or career can take place smoothly. But if he clings to illusions that are contrary to reality, then problems will surely arise. No one can take the step into life without making certain assumptions, and occasionally these assumptions are false. That is, they do not fit the conditions into which one is thrown. Often, it is a question of exaggerated expectations, underestimation of difficulties, unjustified optimism, or a negative attitude. One could compile quite a list of the false assumptions that give rise to the first conscious problems. But it is not always the contradiction between subjective assumptions and external facts that gives rise to problems. It may just often be inner psychic difficulties. They may exist even when things run smoothly in the outside world. Very often it is a disturbance of psychic equilibrium caused by the sexual instinct. Equally often is the feeling of inferiority, which springs from an unbearable sensitivity. These inner conflicts may exist even when adaptation to the outer world has been achieved without apparent effort. It even seems as if young people who have had a hard struggle for existence are spared inner problems, while those who for some reason or another have no difficulty with adaptation run into problems of sex or conflicts arising from the sense of inferiority. People whose own temperaments offer problems are often neurotic, but it would be a serious misunderstanding to confuse the existence of problems with neurosis. There is a marked difference between the two in that the neurotic is ill because he is unconscious of his problems, while the person with the difficult temperament suffers from conscious problems without being ill. If we try to extract the common and essential factors from the almost inexhaustible variety of individual problems found in the period of youth, we meet in all cases with one particular feature, a more or less patent clinging to the childhood of consciousness, a resistance to the fateful forces in and around us which would involve us in the world. Something in us wishes to remain a child, to be unconscious, or at most conscious only of the ego. To reject everything strange, or else subject it to our will. To do nothing, or else indulge our own craving for pleasure or power. In all this, there is something of the inertia of matter. It is a persistence in the previous state whose range of consciousness is smaller, narrower, and more egotistic than that of the dualistic phase. For here, the individual is faced with the necessity of recognizing and accepting what is different and strange as a part of his own life, as a kind of also I. The essential feature of the dualistic phase is the widening of the horizon of life, and it is this that is so vigorously resisted. To be sure, this expansion, or distol, as Goethe called it, has started long before this. It begins at birth, when the child abandons the narrow confinement of the mother's body, and from then on it steadily increases until it reaches a climax in the problematical state, when the individual begins to struggle against it. What would happen to him if he simply changed himself into that foreign seemly also I, and allowed the earlier ego to vanish into the past? We might suppose this to be quite a practical course. The very aim of religious education, from the exhortation to put off the old Adam right back into rebirth rituals of primitive races, is to transform the human being into the new future man and to allow the old to die away. Psychology teaches us that in a certain sense, there is nothing in the psyche that is old, nothing that can really, finally die away. Even Paul was left with a thorn in the flesh. Whoever protects himself against what is new and strange and regresses to the past falls in the same neurotic condition as the man who identifies himself with the new condition and runs away from the past. The only difference is that the one who has strangled himself from the past and the other from the future. In principle, both are doing the same thing. They are reinforcing their narrow range of consciousness instead of shattering it in the tension of opposites and building up a state of wider and higher consciousness.